Hey, everybody, welcome back to Practical Liberty. My name's Henry Bingaman. A lot of us are worried about the direction the country's taking, and the United States has a long history of freedoms ebbing and flowing, and they're kind of on the ebb right now. So a lot of people have been considering, what do I do if crap really goes south in the U.S.? Well, today's guest, Coley Hudgins, has been living a lifestyle called flag theory for several years now, which is getting some of your assets and diversifying internationally. Now, I've just started to get into this, just started to research it, so I don't know that much about it, which is why I'm really excited to welcome Coley. Thanks, man, for joining me.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Henry. I appreciate it. Look forward to it.
So you're down in Panama right now, is that right?
Yep. I've been down here since 2006. Was originally in Washington, D.C. Had spent several years in Washington, D.C. Got, for all the reasons you said, got a little pessimistic about the kind of the future direction of the way things were going in the U.S. And so my wife and I uprooted our family in 2006 and moved down to Panama.
So what were you seeing as the biggest risks back in 2006? Obviously, you got out a couple of years before the great recession, the big financial crisis back then. What were you seeing there that kind of made you really think about escaping at the time?
Really, it was a lack of personal freedoms, or an erosion rather of personal freedoms. And it was, it was just kind of this drip, drip, drip that I was noticing, starting in 2006. And then the 2008 financial crisis was kind of the icing on the cake. We were already in Panama at the time. I was still traveling back to the U.S. quite a bit for business, and I still do travel back to the U.S. quite a bit for work. But the just the extraordinary nature of the financial bailout and the Wall Street collapse and all of that, and then kind of the ensuing further erosion of of our rights as Americans, made me pretty pessimistic. And so we decided to set up shop in Panama. And I can tell you that a lot of times you hear that, these third world countries or these developing countries, are dangerous, or they're corrupt, or they, you don't have a lot of personal freedom. This is just not the case. Here the issue is, thankfully, the government really just doesn't have the resources to crack down on your individual rights and your individual liberties the way they do, the way the massive government in the U.S. does. And so, I find, and most of the people that I know find, that we just have a lot more personal freedom here in Panama, which may be counterintuitive, but it just seems to be the case.
I'm curious, how did so for COVID lockdown type things, what did Panama do in those terms?
Well, okay, so Panama could be, or I'm sorry, the pandemic could be the exception to the rule. They were pretty strict on the lockdown here in Panama, and there was a point over a couple of months, I think, where it was people were confined to their homes for I think it was 20 hours a day. But again, the issue was, that was kind of the government decree. But the reality was they really didn't have the resources or the infrastructure to monitor that. And so for us, it was kind of business as usual. We traveled around the country. We went to the beaches. We surfed. We went up to the mountains. It wasn't really as noticeable to us, even though the government had issued kind of these rules and regulations. It wasn't a lot of people just didn't comply with them.
Yeah, I feel like, I'm up in the mountains now, and I moved out of Philadelphia. I've lived there for over a decade, and I was getting stir crazy during the beginning of the lockdowns there. Everything was shut down. Then I moved up to the mountains, and, technically the same rules apply, but nobody followed them. You didn't see masks anywhere. Restaurants weren't closed like they were supposed to be. We had tourists reporting restaurants, which was annoying. Mostly the tourists coming down from New York would report the restaurants, and you're just go back to communist New York, man. Come on. But no, I think there's an interesting perception for people that are raised in America that, I think it's like just decades of folklore that the lack of freedom is like Soviet Union style, and the United States is the apex of freedom. There's nothing freer. But it's just everyone I've talked to that lives out of the country denies that reality. That's just not the way the rest of the world works.
It's absolute nonsense. I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions that that a lot of Americans have, that the rest of the world is kind of this dangerous, forbidding place, that and that you risk the government cracking down on you. You risk being robbed in the streets. We've been here since, as I said, since 2006. I've never even been looked at crosswise. I've never faced any sort of harassment by the police or the government or anything like that. I've never been pickpocketed. I've never been robbed. I've never been held up. It's a very safe country, and I still have friends in the U.S. that think I'm crazy, that I'm living in this developing country or this third world country.
So before we were so rudely interrupted, you were saying you have some friends that think you're a little crazy for moving down to Panama.
Yeah, most do, actually. Most of my friends do. Most of my clients do. And then if I can get them down here, which I've done, it's a total mind shift, because they just see how free you are. How all of the nonsense that and the preconceptions that they may have about the developing world or third world countries or whatever, it's just foolishness. And I was saying before we were cut off, if you go to the State Department website today and look at the advisories for Panama, you'll see stuff that will just scare the dickens out of you. But it's just not true. It's just we've never run into any problems here at all. It's a very peaceful, relaxed country. In fact, they say kind of the phrase they use here is it's tranquilo, everything's tranquil, and that's sure been my experience. They're just very relaxed, laid back folks. You do get, I get pulled over by the police for, if I'm speeding in my car or whatever. But they never give you attitude. They're friendly. They chat with you. They'll ask, they'll ask, hey, you're a gringo. Where are you from? You can kind of shoot the breeze with them. Half the time they'll just be like, yeah, slow down. So yeah, it's a really cool place, man. I really enjoy living here.
So before we get into the actual flag theory part of it, what made you choose Panama in the first place?
Well, it's an interesting question. At the time, I was a partner in a firm in DC, and this again was before the financial crisis. And I had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and a wife, and we were rapidly kind of getting sick of DC, and we decided to look at Central America, primarily because we still wanted to, be within, relatively short traveling distance to the U.S. to visit family and friends and things like that. And we looked at a lot of countries. We spent a lot of time in Nicaragua, in Belize, in Costa Rica. Panama, frankly, wasn't even on our list. Didn't know anything about it except, this was the place that the U.S. invaded when Noriega was in charge. And a friend of mine said, you really should check it out. It is a very modern, developing country. It has a growing middle class, a major financial sector, good hospitals, good infrastructure. The infrastructure was all built, or most of it was built by the Americans as a consequence of the Panama Canal. And so we took a trip here in 2006, and it was exactly as my friend described it. I mean, it's a big consideration for us with 2 young kids was, all right, do we have access to medical care? Do we have access to clean water? Do we have good access to medical care and clean water? Are the roads good? things like that. And there's first world medical care here, and it's at a fraction of the costs that you would pay in the U.S. The hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in the city, is a Johns Hopkins affiliated hospital, and it's great medical care. We've used it several times. My now soon to be ex-wife, we had our third child there, and so that was a big consideration for us. And then, in addition to all of that, great beaches, great surfing, and it's a very small country. So for a lot of those reasons, and stable government. And so for a lot of those reasons, it went from not even being on our list to being at the very top of the list.
So I'm curious, how do you define stable government? Because people consider the U.S. government stable, and I have some questions about that. But
well, yeah, I guess I should stipulate stable by Latin American standards.
Okay.
So the way the government works here is it's 5-year terms for the chief executive, the president, and you don't after you've served your 5-year term, you can't run again. And they've had a stable transition of government without violence, without corruption. Well, I should say not without corruption, but without violence. They've had a peaceful transfer of government every 5 years since Noriega, since the Noriega years. Now, a point about the corruption is, yes, there's corruption here. There's corruption all over Latin America. There's corruption all over the U.S. So here it's at a much smaller scale because it's a much smaller country. And what I tell people a lot is, okay, if you think that Panama is corrupt, you're talking about a fraction of the corruption that you would see in what we consider first world countries, where it's massive. And here it's just at a much smaller scale because it's a much smaller country.
Yeah, so it's just manageable corruption, which is,
exactly.
The history of the world is full of corruption. You're never going to get away from it. So if you have governments, you're going to have corruption. It's just a natural consequence of accumulating power. I'm curious about the currency, because I think one of the things a lot of people, especially in my audience, I have a lot of Bitcoiners. I'm a big Bitcoiner. I like the crypto technologies. But one of the things I worry about in the U.S. is just a currency collapse, because, we've inflated the crap out of the dollar, printed all the money for stimulus and COVID relief. But, the argument is there's still, despite all the damage done to the dollar, there's no better currency in the world. So what is the currency in Panama, and how stable and secure do you feel it is right now?
Well, interestingly enough, it's the dollar.
Oh.
So they call it the Balboa, but the currency is the dollar. So they use the dollar for coins. They mint their own coins, but the dollar is the coin of the realm here. However, as I understand it, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but as I understand it, it's in the Constitution that that they can quickly move to another currency. If, for instance, the dollar collapsed. So it's a dollarized economy here in Panama.
So that actually, I think, brings us to flag theory, because the idea of flag theory is that you don't centralize all your risk into one sovereign country, right?
Yep.
So can you kind of go through? I think the original one was like 5 flags, but you said before we jumped on the call, before we started recording, that they're up to maybe 7. Can you kind of run through the flags and the general premise of flag theory?
Yeah, sure. So, flag theory is a really interesting concept that I discovered after the financial crisis in 2008. And basically what it is it's a way to hedge what is considered sovereign risk, the risk from governments taking your stuff across as many different governmental or sovereign jurisdictions as you can, so that you're essentially properly hedged. And I think the original 5 flags related to citizenship and residency, taxation, where your business is located, banking, having an offshore bank account. And then I think the fifth one is, where are your physical assets or your investment assets like gold and real estate and things like that. And then, since then, as we've kind of gotten more and more into the digital age, they've added, some additional flags like, where your digital assets stored, things like cryptocurrency or your important documents or things like that. Are they stored in the U.S. or in other sovereign jurisdictions that that accept that have wider acceptance of assets like crypto, and then digital security, websites, client accounts, your documents, things like that. So those would be the two new flags, if you will.
I'm curious, how do you secure from sovereign risk against those? Because you would imagine those are more secure, I guess, just because you can put them on like crypto can go on a hardware wallet and, you can sneak it with you anywhere. So
Yeah.
is that part? It's like a hardware wallet. Is there a non-sovereign entity, I guess, in that regard?
Well, that one's, I haven't really embraced that one, to be honest.
Okay.
And like you, I have a digital wallet. But if you look at, it's interesting, if you look at places like El Salvador right now, I mean, El Salvador is really accepting of cryptocurrencies. And they've kind of staked their future on it. And, they have a kind of a young, new elected leader that is fully embraced crypto assets and blockchain and Bitcoin and things like that. So it's a really interesting haven right now, I think, for for folks in kind of the digital asset space. And who would have ever thought that that a country like El Salvador would be so forward leaning in that respect. So that could be in the digital asset flag. I think that is a pretty interesting place to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of smaller countries are forced to innovate, where the big countries like the U.S. can kind of just rely on legacy systems. We don't have to innovate in financial systems. Where a country like El Salvador that wants to grow and kind of enter the game with the big boys has to do more interesting things. So it does kind of make sense to me that those places would be more innovative.
For sure.
Do you have citizenship down in Panama now?
No, I don't. I have residency. And so, if you consider the first flag citizenship and residency, I have permanent residency here in Panama. I could get citizenship, and I haven't ruled it out. My third daughter was born here in Panama, so she's a Panamanian citizen. And under the citizenship rules in Panama, I think when my daughter turns 18, I can apply for citizenship in Panama. And I'm undecided on whether I'm going to do that yet. Not because I wouldn't like a second passport necessarily, but just because it takes a while and there's costs involved. But the residency process was fairly straightforward and easy. And I think it took me about 7 or 8 months to get residency in Panama. And what it comes, I have a cedula, which is an official Panamanian ID. I just got my concealed carry permit here in Panama 2 months ago, which I couldn't have done without residency, but that took 7 or 8 months. So it's about as close to citizenship as you can get. The only thing I can't do is vote in the elections. But it was a fairly straightforward process. There in Panama and a lot of these emerging developing countries, they're actually encouraging folks from the US and Canada and European countries to come down and either establish residency or get citizenship. So there's a number of programs here in Panama where you can come in, you can invest in real estate. It could be your primary residence, And for let's say 200, the rules are changing a lot, so I don't know the exact figures, but for say a $250,000 investment, if you bought a condo or a house or something like that, you can apply for residency. The rules here, even if you don't have residency, for the US and Canada and most European countries are super easy. You actually really don't even need residency. You can come down for 6 months, leave for a day, and then come back, and you get another 6 months. And people have been doing that down here for years, so they never even get official residency. But they'll take a trip to go home for Christmas or cross the border into Costa Rica or go see friends and then come back, and they're here for another 6 months. But yes, we have residency, and we've had it for 2006, and we'll have it as long as we're here. So
I guess how many of the flags do you have planted, for lack of a better term? Because I know, are you banking down in Panama, or how much are you spreading out this sovereign risk?
So I probably have, at the moment, I probably have maybe 4 of the 5 flags. So I'm a resident of Panama. I have an offshore company here in Panama. I also have an offshore, a U.S. based C corporation and an LLC and things like that. But I have an offshore company. I've got bank accounts here in Panama. So let's see, that would be 3, and physical assets. Homes, real estate, things like that. What I don't have is residency for taxation purposes, and I could do that. It's a little more complicated. And I can try to explain it to you. Because all of my clients are in the U.S., my income is U.S. sourced. It means I pay no taxes in Panama, because my clients are not Panama based. I only pay taxes in the U.S., but I have to pay taxes in the U.S.
Is that just federal?
Yeah, just federal. I don't pay any state taxes. I just pay federal. And that gets to the question of where you're domiciled. So the other important consideration in establishing residency, that you can't do if you're not a resident, is I'm actually domiciled in Panama, which means I don't have a domicile in a state in the U.S., so I'm not subject to state taxes. So when I was in D.C., for instance, based on my level of income, I was paying, I think some years, another $20,000, $30,000, $35,000, $40,000 in DC taxes that I don't pay anymore. I just pay federal taxes. And so that's a big benefit of establishing residency, as well as if you're in a tax jurisdiction like a DC, you're not paying any more DC taxes.
Right. So if you save $50,000 a year in taxes and bought a $250,000 condo in Panama, it would pay for itself in 5 years, basically.
Yeah. Essentially, that's right.
I mean, it's kind of amazing. So what are, I guess, the biggest headaches in doing it? Because, I've looked into it a little bit, and I'm like, well, would, my clients want to do business with a, I don't know, Panama LLC, or I don't know what the business structures are there, but I guess you're doing business in a U.S. company. I guess, yeah, just what are the biggest headaches? I don't even know what to think about with those.
Well, as I said, I mean, we made a lot of mistakes when we first did it, and it was, it's now been more than 10 years ago, and the rules change. And so you have to, you have to stay updated on what the current citizenship and residency requirements are for any country. And I'll say it's not just Panama that offers some pretty attractive citizenship and residency programs. Places like Uruguay, Paraguay, those are the countries I can think of in Latin America. But there are a lot of really interesting jurisdictions now that are offering some great benefits for citizenship and residency, again, because they want to encourage comparatively well-off first world citizens from the US or Canada or Europe to come and settle and spend money. The biggest headaches, as I recall, when we were going through the process, is, it requires a lot of research on the front end. And there are a number of law firms in Panama that can help you through that process and explain exactly there's a lot more now than we were going through it 10 years ago, but there's a lot of law firms that kind of specialize in this. And so they can tell you among the different categories of programs that you can come in for citizenship and residency, which ones might best apply to your situation. That was a headache for us because it was a little less defined when we were going through the process. That was one headache. The second headache is it takes time and it takes a lot of paperwork. So we just committed ourselves to getting it done, but you have to do things like you have to get if I recall, you have to get an FBI clearance report from the U.S. government that you're not an axe murderer, that you haven't been convicted of crimes. That's fairly straightforward. It's not that hard to do. You have to, depending on what program you're coming in under, you have to provide documentation. For instance, if you are coming in under the retiree program, you have to provide proof that that you have sufficient assets that you're not going to be a drain on the state. So you have to provide your investments, your investment information that if you have if you have a retirement account, you got to show that it's funded enough that you're not going to become a drain on the state. And there's a minimum. The minimums are really low. You have to prove that you've got $1,000 a month in income coming. It's not a lot of money. So that pulling together the paperwork was a hassle. And then inevitably it's a developing country. So there's paperwork and, it gets stuck on the bureaucrat's desk and, your lawyer has to go down and incentivize the bureaucrat to move your paperwork to the top of the list, buy them lunch or a gift or whatever. And that's just the way it's done. But other than that, it wasn't that big a hassle. That's for citizenship and residency. The banking rules are a little more challenging, or they can be a little more challenging. So let's just say you've established residency, and this is you're now let's say a resident of Panama. Then you have to establish a bank account, to get that next flag, and that also requires a lot of paperwork. What also happens is you get a lot more scrutiny from the banks here than you would opening an account in the U.S. But there's some caveats to that, and I'll see if I can explain them. So one of the things they really are concerned about here for foreign residents opening a bank account is that they want to make sure that you're not laundering money, that you're not involved in drugs, things like that. So they require a lot of paperwork to make sure that's not the case. The other thing that we are subjected to from time to time is, if I make a larger deposit to my Panamanian bank account, if I wire funds from the U.S., for instance, I'll get a call from the bank saying, "What is this money being used for?" And they will ask me a lot of questions about it. The important caveat, though, or the important thing to consider is that's not Panama's fault. That's the U.S.'s fault, because the U.S. is requiring Panamanian banks to scrutinize any deposits that come from U.S. citizens. And so I don't fault Panama for it.
Right.
There was legislation passed, I think it was in 2017, called FATCA. FATCA is the acronym. It's FATCA, and it's the Foreign Assets Transfer and Control Act. And that's really, where the problem lies, is that the U.S. passed a law that requires all of these banks in other countries to, give their their residents, their U.S. residents, a proctology anytime they want to wire money into their banks. So it's not Panama's fault. So that's something that you have to deal with as well.
So when you're transferring it and they ask the questions, how much do they follow up? Like if you say, oh, I'm transferring $200,000 because I'm going to buy a property, do they actually track that? Like, how much proof do you need? I'm just wondering if somebody were unscrupulous and trying to game the system a little bit. All right, that's it for the first half of my conversation with Coley. In the next part of this conversation, we talk about banking offshore in the U.S. We talk about the pros and cons there. We talk about the one asset the IRS has the hardest time coming after. So this is something you want to pay attention to if you're thinking about flag theory. And we talk about the benefits of an offshore company and why it might be a much better option than a U.S. company. Also, I have a free gift for you if you want to become more free in your own life. It's a simple checklist that helps you improve your security, your wealth, your awareness, and build a better network. In other words, build more freedom in your own life. You can get that checklist for free at henrybing.co/liberty. That's henrybing.co/liberty for that free checklist to help you become more free. All right, I'll see you back in a couple days.